I have my setting lever here all cleaned and ready to go. I'm just going to wipe around the inside edge and this surface lightly with some molybdenum paste, just so there's not too much friction here. This is the settings point here, and this is tab on here, registers against our f-stops there, so that's the way the lever goes up. I'll rotate that to the screw holes are visible, which is there and there. And pop my shoulder screws in place. Now the thread on these shoulder screws is very short. Of course it's a very fine thread. Try not to cross thread it. And do not over tighten it, otherwise you'll strip it out. I'm looking at the back here now to see how far that screw came through, and the first one I put in didn't come through very far, which suggests that it's not in correctly, or it might be cross threaded. So let me back that out. Have another go. That's done up. You need to be fairly cautious with those. They're easily stripped out. And there's our settings lever. Now there's a fairly controlled drag on this, you could say. It's smooth in operation, but it's not so loose that you'd easily knock it out of place. They could probably have a little bit more friction than that and still be very acceptable. If they're loose, you take this lever off and give it a slight bend. Only slight bend, but it just means that it provides more friction of this lever against the back of the case, so that you're less likely to accidentally bump your aperture settings while you're setting, either cocking the shutter or adjusting the focus or making some other change. But this is working well, and I can tell that the blades are moving smoothly. There's no friction on the blades themselves there. I can see some marks on that blade there. I'm just going to have a look at that with a bit of solvent. I may have put that down on the mat while I was working and picked up a bit of grease. No, that's fine. So there's our shutter case, and we have the mechanism plate, of course, all clean and ready to go. So all I need to do here is clean my shutter blades, which are very dirty and greasy looking, and quite possibly the stones may or may not clean off with the solvent, in which case they'll need to be polished with some brass soap to get those surfaces clean. I don't know if you can see how bad those blades are, but they're very, very stained. So I'll clean those, then reassemble it. Well, I've cleaned these blades with solvent, but they're still fairly marked. You can see the shadow, the overlap there where the other blade sat on top of that one. This one here, I don't know whether that shows well in the picture here. There's a patch of corrosion here. Yeah, that's showing very well there. That looks better on the camera than it does in practice to the eye. So yes, you can certainly see, it's because of the angle of the light, I suppose, that there's a patch of corrosion here. That's quite pronounced, that corrosion. Some of the other blades appear quite good from a distance, but the surface of the blade is not as smooth as I would expect. It's like there are tiny tiny bumps of corrosion on them. So these blades, I'll have to polish these with some brass until they are nice and smooth and are likely to run properly. I have to say this looks much worse on the camera with the angle of the light than it does to the eye, but certainly it does need to be polished up. So I'll polish those blades up and then hopefully I can assemble the shutter. My blade's all cleaned and I was putting them back in the shutter as a test run to see how well it would fit, and I can see this blade is caught under the edge of the screw head at this point, of course, where it's not supposed to be. So that means that screw is not down tight enough. Which is odd. Anyway, back to where we were. Zoom out a little bit. That'll do. I've got my 5 blades all cleaned and polished. They all came up very well, with the exception of the one that had the corrosion patch on it, which cleaned up quite well, but it's by no means perfect. The others are all perfect. I'm going to put that blade in the number 5 position. I think the corrosion, I don't think any of that will be visible through the front of the shutter. It's all back hidden at this point. It never comes across into here. So these blades, let's get this mechanism plate in the correct position. So first I've got to cock it. Then I've got to disconnect this arm here, move this blade actuating ring into the blade's open position. And the blade open position is there. Now I've got I made a mark here and 2 marks there to show me where my blades were going to go. So I start at position number 1. This blade at position number 2. Let's rotate this. Position number 3. Position number 4, and the blade with the corrosion patch on it, position number 5. Now I need to fit my case over the mechanism plate. I'll pop this up on a block of wood so that I can work on it easily. The case goes on in one position. There are 2 mounting holes close together at this point, here and here, match here and here. So the case goes on here. Got to get my flash contact at this point hooked under the mechanism plate. That should do it. And I'll just check the rotation of the mechanism plate. Yes, that's correct. I can see the screw holes through there. I'll just check that I've got access to 4 screw holes. I do. Doesn't look like any blades are displaced. I'm holding that together carefully with my fingers at that point so it doesn't come to pieces. Put 4 screw holes and I've got to put the screws back in. Well, I know that the 2 short screws go here and here and here. The 3rd of the short screws goes here, and the long screw, I know from experience, goes over here. Often you'll find that the case is marked with a little cross or something at this point, so that as people have marked it to remind them where the long screw fits. There's no mark on this case. There was a mark somewhere else, however, and I haven't worked out why it was there yet. I'll do up those 4 screws. I've only done them up lightly. push this back into place and check the action of the shutter. And if I hold the main lever back with my finger from running too quickly, I'll see that the B lever does drop in and stop the action, and as I let the shutter release up, the shutter closes. So it's all working smoothly and promptly, and as a result I can do those 4 screws up tight, knowing that no shutter blades have been displaced or otherwise causing problems. That's good. Next, this detent spring. This detent spring fits over here. Oh look, I've put one of those screws in the wrong place. These 2 screws are transposed. And I did say that sometimes people mark the case so they'll know where to put the long screw back. Well, I don't know whether you can see it, but there is a mark right here. Somebody had marked the case and I had simply put the screw back in the wrong place. So there you go. That shows the usefulness of making a mark so you'll know where the screw goes back, and I had simply got it wrong. There we go. So now we're good to go, and here is where our detent spring fits. And there's our detent spring. So it fits over the screw head there. Can you see that? Yeah, you can see that. Okay, so it fits over the screw head there. I'll get it hooked into position. That was easy, it just dropped over. And the loose end, can you see that? Yeah. That's got to be lifted over and hooked behind the little boss on the blade actuating ring there. So it sits like that. And that acts to keep the shutter firmly in the closed position unless it's been activated by the main lever, because it acts to return the blade actuating ring in this direction to a parked position. So that's all good. Right, what next? Our flash sink really needs to go in next, and our pieces are the flash contact here, the spacer bush that goes on top of it, the lever that operates the flash contact, and the screw that runs through there to hold the mechanism together. So to get our flash contact in place, there's a tiny rivet on the base of this contact which has to drop into a hole in the mechanism plate. It's a bit awkward to get it wriggled in. But it locates that contact. There, it just popped in. On top of that goes that little bush, that spacer. On top of the spacer goes this arm. It goes that way up. And then the screw goes in place. It's a shouldered screw, so this lever is free to rotate around that shoulder. That's fine, and when I work the shutter, the flash contact should make at this point. Oh, let's do that slowly. Yep, that looks good. It's only just touching it. I'm not convinced that that's contacting it very well. I should check that with an electronic flash. Doesn't want to go on. Oh, is it wiggling on? Yep, no, it's something odd there. Well, that flash pin, that contact there, is buggered up. Something's stuck in it. It's got a broken off pin in there, I think. I'll have to see if I can fix that. Well, the contact was just clogged up with dirt. The electronic flash hooks up to that fine now, and if I fire the shutter, the flash does fire. There we go. So that's all good. Our flash contact is fine, and I can carry on with the rest of the shutter. In this case, my next task is to clean the retard gear train and the self-timer or delay action. Well, I did say that the shutter blades had cleaned up well, and that little patch of corrosion was invisible from the front of the shutter, and that certainly is the case. Those blades are fine now. They're nice and clean, look polished and correct. Their diaphragm blades at the back are in a similar state. There you can see the back of the shutter blades, and again they're all nice and clean. Right, I can put this retard gear train back in now. Now, getting these back in place is a bit of an act because you have to actually swing the arm inwards to get this to drop into place. That's it. So this longer screw, that goes in this position. That's the pivot for the retard gear train, for the adjustment of the retard gear train. I'll get that in, just to run it up loosely. At this point here, got to make sure that the tail here is sitting either side of this upright on the blade actuating ring. The other screw goes here. The head on this is a bit chewed up, and here's where you can adjust the retard gear train slightly. You don't tighten that screw right up. You can adjust the position of the retard gear train usually slightly inwards or slightly outwards for greater or lesser engagement. There's very little movement on that one. Some have more than others, so I'll get that in place. Now if I fire the shutter, we should get something like 1 second. That runs nice and smooth, and if I hold my finger down on the shutter release, you get B. That's working well. So I'll just tighten those two screws up. The shutter's got to be in the cocked position to get to the position of this screw. When it's fired, the sector gear comes across there and you can't get to it. So that's fine. Now, the self-timer or delay action. Could turn this round until this cutout in the sector here is facing roughly towards the centre, otherwise you can't fit it in place. That should sit there. Now, interestingly, someone has scratched an X at this point. I'm not sure why they'd need to do that. Sure, they had their reasons. Drop that down. Now this little catch under here, I'm swinging that across to hold the end of this retard gear train self-timer in place. Just checking the action of that. That feels nice and smooth. And I need to fit its return spring in place. Well, here's its return spring. Fits over the post at this end and has to hook over the post here at this end. So it has to be threaded through underneath here. And typically I want to get this end in place first, that's much easier. That's fine. And this end I can pick up with my tweezers and stretch out. Oh, it's popped off. These tweezers are a fine, they're good for small tasks, but it's hard to get a grip on something like a spring. Let's get this spring back over that tab. Try another pair of tweezers. These ones. Stretch the spring out, hook it over the post. There it goes. Okay, so we cock the shutter. That cocked, it's cocked. Fire. The self-timer starts to run down. And there's the shutter running. So that runs nice and smoothly, that's very good. I've just got to clean this speed settings cam and put that in place. That's quite clean. We know someone had been at the shutter. Perhaps they'd been in as far as removing the shutter speed setting cam here. So all those contact surfaces I'm just lubricating with a wipe of molybdenum paste. And if I fit this in place, should sit about there. This should be B if I set it at that point. That's fine. At 1 second I think should be about here. Yeah, there. That sounds good. 1/10 of a second should be here. That sounds good. If I set the delay action or self-timer, fire the shutter, that's running down smoothly. And there's the shutter firing. So that's all good. It only leaves this little component here to go back in. And I'll show you what that does. As it stands at the moment, even if you set the shutter to B, which would be there, you're able to set the self-timer. There's nothing to stop you setting the self-timer. Of course, having a self-timer and a shutter set to B is meaningless, because if you're not there to hold the shutter button down, B doesn't do anything useful. So if you watch this, you'll see that the self-timer will run down and then the shutter will just fire at its default speed, which is in this case going to be something very fast, like a 500 does the shutter do? Or is it a 300? But that's what happens when it's set to B and the self-timer is set. This little bracket, this little thing here, is designed to stop you being able to set the shutter set the self-timer if the shutter is set to B. It blocks you from being able to move it. So that while the shutter is set to B, you can't set the self-timer. If the shutter is set to 1 second, no problem, you can set the self-timer. So that little bracket, that little piece of metal, that's its task. It's to stop you setting the shutter to B and setting the self-timer at the same time, because that would be a meaningless thing to do. The shutter's ready now. I can close up the front of it. So I will put the front cover in place. I'm just wiping that to get rid of all the dust and dirt. And this should fit in there. Now it's got 2 notches at the back. Now they line up with pins on the shutter so that it only goes in one position. And it goes in something like, let's rotate this till it locks in place. There we go. Is that us? Just looking at my camera. Does it go that way or does it go the other way? Yeah, it goes there. And here's our retainer ring. Now that started very easily. I'm reminded that it didn't come off the shutter easily, but it went back on easily. What's happening? Is it just contacting that screw head? Now, how tight do you need to do that thing up? Well, if you overdo it, you'll end up damaging the thread. There's nothing surer than that. If the settings ring here is too stiff, then you've probably got it too tight. Let's back this off a bit. This is quite stiff. Take it about 2 notches. That seems fine. Let's back it off 1 more notch for good measure. That's good. And I'll turn that lock screw, which locks that retaining ring in place. And there we have it. Just blow that dust out and our shutter is basically done. And all this requires now is to have the lenses cleaned and fitted back in place. But the shutter's good to go. I've got to clean the lenses. I've got the rear group here. And I'm just taking some naphtha and running around the mount, running around the threaded part, just to make sure I clear off any oil or dirt that's on there before I clean the glass. So glass cleaner next. Well, this rear lens group, although I'd been told it had been cleaned, is by no means clean. I'm cleaning the inner surface here and it's virtually flat, and I'm watching reflections on the glass as I tilt it to be able to judge more accurately how clean I've got it. So that can go in place on the back of the shutter. And I'll use a friction tool to tighten that up. And the outer surface, I'll just clean that now. You'd expect to have more marks on the outer surface, if only fingerprints from handling it while you're working on it, even if you try and avoid them. Right, well that's good. So now I need the centre element in place, which is this one here, and I want to clean that, and starting with some naphtha, clean the inside of that completely. I can see here that there's grease and dust in here, and I need to get rid of all of that before I attempt to clean the glass. So I'll use a bit of naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid on a cotton bud, and wipe out the thread there first of all. Most important to make sure that you clean away any grease or dust or anything else that's in here before cleaning the glass itself. You often get small particles of metal that might have come off the threads. You don't want those settling on the glass while you're trying to clean it. You'll end up scratching the glass. Well, as you can see, I've cleaned and refitted the central group to this lens. That's cleaned up very well. There's no problem there at all. That's good. What I did notice on this was that it had been cleaned to death on the inside. On the back of the middle group, the glass is crimped into the brass fitting, and where that happens, you're left with a beveled edge on the glass lens that is exposed. Now, that typically should be covered with black paint, and that's to stop it creating any flare on the image on the film. Now, this lens had been cleaned to the extent that there was no black paint left on that edge, and so you would have had quite a considerable problem with flare as a result with that, because it would have just been like effectively it'd be like a ground glass circle around the outside edge of the lens, which would have just cast light into the film. Anyway, that's been dealt with. I just covered that up with some matte black paint, and that glass looks nice now. The front piece, the front element here. Now this is retained in the brass mount with a retainer ring here, and that retainer ring was actually loose, so that when I picked this up it had a distinct rattle. Now the owner had mentioned there'd been a rattle in the lens, but I couldn't detect it earlier, but that's what it was. That front group was floating backwards and forwards inside the brass mount because the retainer ring was loose. That's all been tightened up now, and I've locked that in place with a spot of lacquer in 4 small places. So that should be fine. So now the front group can be fitted back into the shutter. So I'll just check that that starts and runs smoothly in the thread. That seems fine, that's good. I'll put a little bit of grease on there. Now it's a multi-start thread, so from a practical point of view it's like having multiple threads here. So I'm applying some grease, and just a spot of grease at about 5 spots around the outside. That'll distribute down the this helical thread. I'm just checking the feel of it to see how smooth it is. There's a bit of resistance there. a little feel of roughness. I don't think it's significant enough to worry about. You don't want the front group to be so loose in the mount that it's easily knocked, otherwise you're always in danger of knocking the focus setting with your finger while you're attempting to cock the shutter, or change the aperture for that matter. So it's useful to have some resistance, but it's quite smooth really. So there we have it, that front lens group is back in place, and here I've got the name ring that went on the front of that. Now I can see from looking at this that this was retained originally with a little spot of glue, I think. It might have just floated, it would certainly float okay. I won't put anything on there, I'll leave that in place. When this is back on the camera and I'm checking the focus, of course, here will be our, where's our focus mark? Here is the focus scale ring which will fit on there, and that will retain both that name ring, of course, and the front ring. Loosen those screws off so that fits down over there easily. That's better. In infinity can't be any further in than that, otherwise it wouldn't fit. So let's just move that round to the infinity mark. And I'll just snip these 3 screws up lightly. This will just retain everything in place until I've got this back on the body and I'm able to check the focus at the film plane, and I'll be using a ground glass screen at the film plane to check the focus. I've certainly felt cameras with a smoother focus adjustment than that, but that's okay, that'll do. It means there's some slight roughness in that brass on the thread somewhere. Most likely something's just rubbed up slightly. That'll be fine. So I've got to service the camera body, and then the shutter assembly can go back on. But I'm pretty confident that's going to work very well indeed. Let's try the self-timer. It's running smoothly. And there's the shutter firing. Right, to the camera body.